The next 2 to 4 years will not be like anything we have seen before. The world is entering a period of unprecedented transformation, a carefully orchestrated convergence of events that will redefine global power, economics, and influence. At first glance, it might appear chaotic, random, even accidental. But when you look closer, patterns emerge: strategic alignments, deliberate economic shifts, and geopolitical maneuvers that point to a coordinated restructuring of the global order. The first and most consequential shift will happen in the United States. The financial system, long regarded as the backbone of global stability, is on the brink of a major reset. This is not merely speculation. The dollar, the foundation of international trade for decades, faces pressures that could trigger a systemic collapse. When the dollar falters, it will unleash a wave of social instability. Middle-class families will lose savings. Pensions will be undermined. Protests will sweep through cities, shaking the social fabric. In response, the United States will be forced to implement digital currency controls, creating a financial environment under constant surveillance. A state watching, tracking, and regulating every transaction. As the dollar loses dominance, American global hegemony will begin to crumble. The financial centers that once defined the world, New York, London, will no longer dictate the flow of power. The epicenter of economic influence will shift eastward toward Asia. This is not just a transfer of wealth, but a recalibration of global authority. Western currencies will devalue, economies will be restructured, and power will be redistributed in a way that favors the emerging multipolar world. Amid this economic realignment, territorial and military calculations are unfolding. In the coming years, strategic actors will exploit America's preoccupation with domestic turmoil. Taiwan stands at the center of this transition. The United States, weakened financially and politically, will face an impossible choice: intervene militarily or let regional dynamics play out. The cost of confrontation will be too high, leaving the path open for decisive action in Asia. The South China Sea will no longer be freely navigable for Western naval forces, cementing a new balance of power. This transition is not limited to Asia. Europe, too, will undergo profound transformations. The European Union will fragment under economic and political pressures. Nations will struggle to agree on fundamental policies, creating competing power centers within the continent. NATO, once the guarantor of transatlantic security, will face its own unraveling. Eastern European countries, seeking stability and economic opportunity, may pivot toward rising powers in the East, forging new alliances with Moscow and Beijing. The old certainties of Western cohesion will dissolve, replaced by a patchwork of strategic realignments. Amid this global turbulence, another player is positioning itself with remarkable strategic foresight. India will emerge as a pivotal swing power. Leveraging its relationships with both East and West, it will navigate the turbulence to extract concessions, mediate disputes, and cement a role as an indispensable arbiter. The traditional Cold War-era alliances, long considered permanent, will no longer hold. Old partnerships dissolve, and new frameworks of cooperation and influence take their place. China's rise during this period is critical to understanding the emerging global order. Unlike the United States, whose economy is highly financialized and consumption-driven, China's economy is rooted in production and industrial strength. This gives it resilience under pressure, allowing it to withstand sanctions and economic coercion. By diversifying away from the dollar and establishing alternative trade networks, China has effectively created a parallel global system, capable of sustaining its growth and influence independently. The consequences are profound. Access to critical technology, essential goods, and international supply chains will be contingent on compliance with new rules set by emerging powers. Economic leverage becomes geopolitical power. The world's financial and technological systems will increasingly operate under these new parameters, diminishing the ability of any single nation to dictate terms unilaterally. The United States, even with its military superiority, faces an uncomfortable reality. Its economic model, reliant on cheap imports and the privileges of global currency dominance, will no longer support the lifestyle and expectations of its population. Any attempt to accept decline peacefully risks domestic unrest and the erosion of elite power. Confrontation, whether intended or accidental, becomes a means to maintain influence and delay systemic collapse. All of these shifts, financial, territorial, strategic, are converging toward a single outcome: the creation of a multipolar world order. Power will be distributed more evenly among nations capable of sustaining economic and military influence. Regional dominance will replace unilateral control. Alliances will be fluid, built on opportunity rather than ideology. And the old certainties of Western preeminence will fade into history. The next 2 to 4 years are the critical window. This is the period in which the global chessboard will be rearranged. Economies will be reshaped. Alliances will be rebuilt, and the balance of power will move eastward. What may seem like chaos is in fact a deliberate convergence, a sequence of events that, whether by design or consequence, will determine the structure of the world for decades to come. Those who pay attention to the underlying patterns, the intersections of economic strategy and geopolitical ambition, will see the emerging order before it becomes undeniable. For the rest, the changes may feel abrupt, unsettling, and irreversible. But the truth is, these transformations are not random. They are the product of a calculated shift toward a new era of shared, multipolar governance. And in this new era, nothing will remain as it was. The United States is approaching a financial inflection point that could redefine its domestic and international position. For decades, the dollar has functioned as the unshakable foundation of global trade, investment, and economic confidence, granting the United States unparalleled influence over the international system. This dominance has allowed the country to run persistent deficits, fund its spending through debt that others willingly purchase, and maintain a standard of living far beyond what its domestic productivity alone would support. Yet this arrangement, once thought permanent, is increasingly fragile. Structural vulnerabilities, combined with aggressive fiscal policies, mounting debt, and systemic over-leverage, are converging to create the conditions for a major reset of the American financial system, one that could destabilize the social fabric and alter the country's position in the global order. The core of this impending transformation lies in the dollar itself. For decades, global trade has been denominated in dollars, from energy markets to international finance. This privilege, sometimes referred to as the exorbitant privilege, has allowed the United States to exert disproportionate influence over the world economy. Other nations have depended on the dollar not merely as a currency, but as a standard of stability, a benchmark for reserves, and a medium for international contracts. However, cracks in this foundation are now becoming evident. Persistent budget deficits, a growing reliance on debt financing, and monetary policy that prioritizes liquidity and consumption over production have gradually eroded confidence in the dollar's long-term stability. These vulnerabilities are compounded by a global shift in economic power. Emerging economies, particularly in Asia, are building alternative financial structures, diversifying reserves away from the dollar, and conducting trade in local or regional currencies, reducing dependence on U.S. monetary supremacy. The collapse of the dollar would not be a minor economic event. It would be a seismic shock to the domestic system. Household wealth in the United States is deeply tied to dollar-based instruments, from retirement savings and investment portfolios to mortgages and consumer credit. A rapid decline in the currency's value would erode purchasing power, devalue savings, and leave millions of Americans exposed to sudden financial insecurity. Middle-class families, historically seen as the backbone of social stability, would bear the brunt of this shift. Their retirement accounts, denominated in dollar assets, would lose value, while everyday expenses, from food to energy, would rise sharply due to inflationary pressures imported from the weakening currency. The consequences would not be purely economic. They would ripple through society, producing widespread anxiety, uncertainty, and ultimately, social unrest. The social ramifications of such a collapse are difficult to overstate. History demonstrates that when a currency loses credibility, it is not merely an economic disruption, but a catalyst for political and social instability. Public trust in institutions erodes when savings evaporate and citizens lose confidence in the government's ability to protect their economic security. In such an environment, protests, civil disobedience, and even localized uprisings become far more likely. Communities that once felt insulated from national crises would be drawn into broader patterns of unrest as the tangible effects of currency collapse, unemployment, inflation, and declining purchasing power permeate daily life. Urban centers, particularly those with high concentrations of financial and commercial activity, would experience acute pressure as residents confront rising costs and shrinking incomes. Rural regions, heavily dependent on commodity prices and government transfers, would also feel the shock, further amplifying nationwide instability. In response to these pressures, the federal government would likely implement measures designed to stabilize the financial system, but these interventions could themselves produce unintended consequences. One of the most probable measures would be the rapid introduction of digital currency frameworks and tighter financial controls. Digital currency, particularly a state-backed electronic dollar, allows the government to track, monitor, and regulate transactions with unprecedented precision. While intended as a tool for stabilizing the economy and preventing capital flight, it simultaneously establishes a framework for a surveillance-based financial system, where individual transactions can be observed and controlled. Citizens' spending, saving, and borrowing behaviors could be monitored in real time, with the government retaining the capacity to impose restrictions, limit access to funds, or enforce compliance with economic directives. The integration of digital currency into everyday life would mark a profound shift in the relationship between the state and the individual, creating new levers of control under the guise of economic stabilization. The implementation of digital currency controls is not merely a technological development. It represents a fundamental transformation of governance. By embedding surveillance into financial systems, the government gains an unprecedented ability to influence behavior, enforce policy, and respond to economic crises. In the context of a dollar collapse, these mechanisms would serve a dual purpose. They would stabilize the financial system while simultaneously mitigating social unrest by controlling access to critical resources. However, the potential for overreach is immense. A state capable of monitoring all economic activity could suppress dissent, shape consumer behavior, and effectively regulate the economic choices of millions of citizens. Such power, while justified in the name of stabilization, introduces profound questions about civil liberties, privacy, and the balance of authority in a democratic society. Beyond domestic considerations, the dollar collapse would reverberate globally, accelerating the redistribution of economic power. Nations dependent on the dollar would face valuation shocks in reserves and trade balances, while countries that have diversified into alternative currencies or regional trade networks would gain relative advantage. The decline of the dollar would force the United States to confront a new reality. Its traditional leverage over international institutions, trade agreements, and financial markets would be diminished. Former allies and trade partners would reassess their relationships, seeking stability and security in emerging economic centers, further eroding the United States' influence. The combination of domestic instability, digital surveillance, and declining international leverage sets the stage for a transformation in both internal governance and global strategy, a period where adaptation is not optional, but essential for survival. The structural weaknesses leading to this reset are compounded by the consumption-driven nature of the American economy. Unlike manufacturing-based economies, where production creates tangible resilience, the United States relies heavily on consumption, financed through credit and dollar privilege. When currency confidence falters, this system becomes acutely vulnerable. Import prices rise, debt burdens increase, and domestic purchasing power declines. Citizens are left exposed to both the direct consequences of currency depreciation and the cascading effects on prices, wages, and employment. This economic fragility is mirrored by a political system ill-equipped to manage such rapid and disruptive changes. Partisan polarization, institutional gridlock, and short-term electoral incentives constrain effective responses, amplifying the risk of both economic and social upheaval. As the financial system destabilizes, the interplay between social unrest and government control will intensify. Digital currency platforms will become instruments not only of economic policy, but of behavioral governance, while protests and public dissent challenge the state's legitimacy and authority. This dynamic, a feedback loop of instability and control, could define the United States' domestic landscape for the foreseeable future, as citizens grapple with declining wealth, eroding purchasing power, and a political system increasingly reliant on technological oversight. The world economy is undergoing a transformation that has been decades in the making, a shift so profound that it threatens to overturn the very structures that have defined global commerce, trade, and finance since the end of World War II. For over a century, Western financial centers, New York, London, Frankfurt have served as the axis of global economic power, dictating the flow of capital, setting monetary standards, and shaping the rules of international commerce. These cities were not merely markets, they were instruments of influence, enabling the United States and Europe to project power far beyond their borders. The dominance of Western financial institutions relied on the dollar and the euro, supported by deep, liquid markets that attracted global investors. Yet today, a confluence of economic, geopolitical, and strategic factors is challenging this arrangement, and a shift of financial gravity toward Asia is accelerating with remarkable speed. The foundation of this shift is the emergence of Asian economies as not only the manufacturing hub of the world, but also as the central node in global finance and trade. Countries like China, India, Japan, and the broader ASEAN bloc have accumulated unprecedented levels of industrial capacity, technological infrastructure, and foreign reserves. China, in particular, has systematically diversified its holdings away from the dollar, investing in local currencies and alternative financial instruments that reduce dependency on Western-dominated systems. By creating a network of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements settled in local currencies, China has established the foundations of an independent economic sphere capable of operating outside the traditional dollar-based system. These arrangements not only protect Asian economies from fluctuations in Western markets, but also strengthen intra-regional ties, fostering a self-reinforcing ecosystem of growth, production, and investment. The decline of Western dominance is both structural and deliberate. Economically, the United States and Europe are burdened by high debt-to-GDP ratios, aging populations, and consumption-driven economies that rely heavily on imports. While Western financial centers have historically thrived by attracting global capital, the shift in global production and savings patterns is reducing their centrality. Asian economies, flush with trade surpluses and foreign reserves, are now exporting capital to their own financial hubs, creating liquidity and investment opportunities independent of New York or London. At the same time, Western policy missteps, from unsustainable monetary interventions to protectionist trade measures, have further weakened confidence in Western economic stewardship. The combination of internal fragility and external competition sets the stage for a historic transfer of financial influence, one that may redefine the rules of the global economic system. Central to this transition is the transformation of financial infrastructure. In Asia, new centers of capital allocation, investment banking, and electronic trading are emerging, rivaling the sophistication of traditional Western hubs. Shanghai and Hong Kong in particular have become not only production centers, but nodes of financial intermediation, offering deep markets for bonds, equities, and derivatives. Singapore, with its stable regulatory environment, is positioning itself as a global wealth management hub, attracting funds from both Asia and the Middle East. These centers are not merely peripheral markets. They are designed to function as alternatives to Western financial dominance, providing liquidity, transparency, and reliability to investors seeking refuge from volatile Western economies. Technology plays a crucial role in this evolution, with digital payment platforms, cross-border settlement systems, and financial technology innovations enabling rapid and efficient capital flows within Asia and beyond. The implications of this eastward shift are profound. First, countries that once relied on the stability of Western markets must recalibrate their strategies. Central banks holding large reserves of dollars or euros may find their holdings depreciating in value, prompting a search for alternative assets and currencies. Corporations dependent on Western financial networks may face higher costs and increased uncertainty. Sovereign debt markets, long anchored by the dollar, may lose their status as the benchmark for global creditworthiness, altering borrowing costs for governments and enterprises alike. The redistribution of capital flows will strengthen Asian economies, allowing them to finance infrastructure, technology, and defense programs independently of Western support, further consolidating regional influence. Second, the shift in economic power has geopolitical consequences. Financial leverage has always been a key instrument of influence. When capital flows predominantly through Western channels, the United States and its allies can exert pressure on other nations through sanctions, trade restrictions, or regulatory mechanisms. As financial gravity moves eastward, these levers of influence diminish. Countries engaging in Asia-centric trade networks may gain autonomy in policy decisions, while the capacity of Western powers to enforce economic compliance is reduced. Asia's rise as a financial center creates a new axis of influence, where economic integration becomes the driver of strategic partnerships and diplomatic alignments. The transition also reshapes the narrative of global development. Emerging markets, long constrained by dependence on Western capital and institutions, now have access to alternative sources of investment and trade. Projects that were previously deemed risky or unprofitable may now find financing through Asian-led development banks, regional infrastructure funds, and sovereign wealth partnerships. This realignment not only shifts economic benefits toward Asia, but also reshapes global governance, as countries participating in these networks gain a voice in establishing standards, rules, and norms for international commerce. Asia, by leveraging its economic weight, can define the frameworks that will guide trade, technology, and finance for decades to come. Moreover, the transition is self-reinforcing. As Western influence wanes, confidence in Asian markets grows, attracting further investment, expertise, and technological development. The rise of Asian financial centers is not merely a reflection of economic growth. It is an instrument for shaping global standards, from currency settlement mechanisms to regulatory compliance frameworks. By establishing alternative infrastructures, Asia is gradually constructing a parallel global financial system, one capable of operating independently from, and in some cases in competition with, the West. This system enhances resilience, mitigates exposure to external shocks, and consolidates the economic ascendancy of the region. Finally, the shift of global economic power is also a psychological transformation. For decades, Western dominance has shaped perceptions of modernity, wealth, and opportunity. As Asia becomes the epicenter of capital, innovation, and production, the perception of where economic opportunity resides will change. Investors, corporations, and governments will increasingly orient toward Asia as the source of stability, growth, and influence. This reorientation is both symbolic and practical, signaling the decline of Western primacy and the emergence of a new Asia-centered global order where financial decisions, technological standards, and economic priorities are increasingly determined by Eastern actors. China's ascent on the global stage is not simply economic. It is strategic, military, and deeply calculated. Over the past decades, China has systematically expanded its influence across Asia, investing in technology, infrastructure, and military modernization with the explicit goal of securing its regional interests. Central to this strategy is Taiwan, an island whose political status and economic importance make it the focal point of a broader contest for regional dominance. For Beijing, Taiwan is not merely a territorial concern. It is a symbol of national unity and sovereignty, a strategic node that influences security calculations across the East and South China Seas, and a gateway to broader technological and industrial control. The coming years may see China taking decisive steps to resolve this long-standing issue, leveraging a period of American distraction and domestic vulnerability to pursue its objectives. The context for potential Chinese action is rooted in the convergence of multiple factors. The United States, traditionally seen as the guarantor of Taiwan's security, is experiencing economic and political stress at home. A major financial reset, coupled with internal social instability, limits Washington's capacity for sustained military engagement abroad. This does not mean the United States lacks military capability, but rather that the cost of intervention in a regional conflict would be prohibitively high, both economically and politically. China, aware of this window of opportunity, has been positioning itself to assert its claims in a manner calculated to minimize direct confrontation while maximizing strategic gain. The military dimension of this strategy is critical. China has invested heavily in capabilities designed specifically for regional deterrence and power projection. Its naval expansion, advanced missile systems, anti-access and area denial denial technologies, and cyber warfare capabilities collectively create a formidable posture in the Taiwan Strait and surrounding waters. The South China Sea, a vital corridor for global trade, is now effectively controlled through a combination of artificial island construction, forward-deployed military assets, and strategic patrols. This control allows China to dictate the movement of shipping lanes, establish maritime dominance, and challenge the freedom of navigation traditionally exercised by Western powers. These measures are not purely defensive. They are designed to establish credible leverage in the event of a regional confrontation, ensuring that any opposition is acutely aware of the risks of interference. The economic implications of Chinese assertiveness are intertwined with the military posture. Taiwan is a hub for advanced semiconductor production, a sector critical to global technology supply chains. Control over Taiwan would grant China a decisive advantage in shaping the future of global technology, from consumer electronics to defense systems. Access to these resources would strengthen China's negotiating position with both Western and developing nations, allowing it to set terms in trade, investment, and technological standards. The potential for economic leverage amplifies the strategic significance of regional dominance, creating a feedback loop where military control, territorial influence, and economic power reinforce one another. China's approach is also calibrated to avoid unnecessary escalation. While capable of direct military action, Chinese strategy emphasizes calculated pressure, coercion, and the creation of fates accomplis. By gradually consolidating influence in contested areas, such as the South China Sea, and by employing non-military tools, economic incentives, diplomatic agreements, and technological dependencies, China can achieve strategic objectives without provoking a full-scale war. The objective is not confrontation for its own sake, but the establishment of a regional order in which China's authority is acknowledged and respected, minimizing the risk of prolonged conflict while maximizing gains. Diplomatically, China leverages its growing global influence to isolate opposition and secure support. Through initiatives such as regional development partnerships, infrastructure investment programs, and multilateral institutions, Beijing cultivates alliances and dependencies that enhance its position in Asia. Nations that might otherwise resist Chinese expansion are drawn into cooperative frameworks that offer economic benefits while reducing the likelihood of confrontation. This multidimensional strategy, combining military readiness, economic leverage, and diplomatic engagement, creates an environment in which China's assertiveness is not seen as aggression by some actors, but as a natural consequence of its growing capabilities and centrality to the regional economy. The United States response is constrained by both perception and capacity. Historically, Washington has relied on deterrence, alliance commitments, and the projection of military power to counterbalance Chinese ambitions. However, the combination of domestic financial instability, social unrest, and economic vulnerability limits the scope for sustained intervention. Policymakers face a dilemma. Any attempt to militarily confront China risks high costs and uncertain outcomes, while failure to respond could undermine credibility and influence. This dynamic creates a strategic window in which China can act decisively, knowing that the risks of direct confrontation are reduced by American domestic constraints. The regional consequences extend beyond Taiwan and the South China Sea. Neighboring countries must navigate a rapidly changing strategic environment, reassessing their security and economic alignments. Nations such as Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and members of ASEAN face difficult choices, balancing reliance on U.S. security guarantees with engagement in China-led economic initiatives. The consolidation of Chinese influence reshapes regional alliances, shifting the balance of power in a way that increasingly favors Beijing. Countries that resist alignment may find themselves economically or diplomatically marginalized, while those that cooperate benefit from investment, trade opportunities, and security assurances, further embedding China's role as the central central actor in Asia. In addition, the global economic system is affected by regional assertiveness. Control over the South China Sea and Taiwan has implications for trade, technology, and investment flows worldwide. Disruptions or perceived instability in these regions impact shipping routes, semiconductor supply chains, and financial markets. Multinational corporations, heavily reliant on stable access to Asian production centers, must account for geopolitical risk in strategic planning, influencing investment decisions, technology development, and operational logistics. The interplay between regional control and global economic stability reinforces the strategic significance of Chinese assertiveness, making Asia not only the center of production, but also the focal point of international economic resilience. China's regional strategy, therefore, is comprehensive, multidimensional, and meticulously calibrated. Military power, economic leverage, technological dominance, and diplomatic engagement are integrated into a unified approach designed to achieve long-term objectives without provoking uncontrollable escalation. The period ahead, particularly the next 2 to 4 years, represents a window in which this strategy can be executed with maximum effect, exploiting the relative weakness and distraction of other powers, particularly the United States, and solidifying China's position as the central actor in regional and global affairs.